All right, Mr. Cusick, that brings us to our 5-year forecast.
All right. All right, good evening, everyone. I first want to thank all of my colleagues for moving closer tonight simply to hear the 5-year forecast. I appreciate that. So tonight's about an update, right? But I want to first remind everyone what the purpose of a 5-year forecast is. So really it serves two very technical purposes. The biggest one is it allows us to sign multi-year agreements, so we can't sign contracts that extend beyond having positive cash balance. And it also allows our OD and the Auditor State's Office to view districts that may be heading into fiscal caution and try to implement measures before worse things happen. But for Worthington, the very practical purpose, it really allows us to have a long-range planning tool to make decisions both on programmatic offerings and when we would need to seek voter support for additional revenue. And so that's what we'll talk a little bit about here tonight. As a reminder, a forecast is presented in the fall in November and it is required to be updated in May. So in the fall, that's considered the baseline year. So if you remember, my presentation went through every line. I will not bore you with all of that tonight, but the May version is simply to provide an update. So I'm going to focus on what changed from the fall. I assure you, if you want to come back in next fall, I will go line by line through all of that once again. But I do want to bring up one key point that I stress every time. On the revenue side, as you can see on the chart on the left, 80% of our revenue comes from local taxpayers. So we are predominantly a locally funded school district. Roughly 20% comes from the state, but 80% comes from local property taxes. And on the expense side, a very similar pie chart where almost 80% is salary and benefits of our staff. We're a service sector employer, so the majority of our resources go toward paying our instructional and support staff. So we'll get right into it. What changed from the November forecast? Really, the answer is not much. On the revenue side, taxes went down, state funding went up. Interest income went up, but in total, over 5 years, revenue changed around $100,000 on almost $1 billion in revenue. So really no change there. On the expense side, in total, expenses went up $7.6 million, but the board has already approved 6.3 of that related to the purchase of the Amazon building, which we negotiated after the fall forecast. So salary and benefits are going down slightly. Inflation is hitting us on service and supply costs. All in total, 7.6 million dollar increase in expenses. And so we'll dive into that just real quick. So revenue, I said 6.1 million decrease. Really, that comes down to commercial property. When we met in the fall, the county this year was a reappraisal year, in case anyone wasn't hiding under a rock. But when we met with county auditor, they indicated close to 30 to 32% on the commercial side and ended up coming in the neighborhood of 20%. So that decreases our revenue slightly. And we also saw some reclassification of commercial property to residential property, and that decreased it. So all in, over 5 years, it's about $1.5 million a year decrease, total of 6.1 million less than we projected. Interest revenue is up. We've continued to see higher interest rates than most experts have thought. So on the good side, our interest revenue is higher. And then corresponding to taxes and valuation being slightly lower, state funding is up. Remember now we have a working formula right now, which is driven by property wealth. And so if our commercial property came in slightly under where we thought it would be, then that ends up adding dollars to state funding. We also had in there $500,000 of reimbursement for ELA materials. That was larger than most of us thought. So all in, a $3.8 million increase helps offset the decrease in taxes. Remember, I mentioned this, but since we do have a working formula, so the state comes up with what they calculate as a per pupil amount to educate a child. In the last biennium, 22-23, that was $7,200. If you recall, we made a lot of effort to increase the inputs. We talked about increasing the inputs, indexing them for inflation. So the base cost per pupil went up to $8,000, almost $8,100 in this biennium. But you subtract the local capacity. Local capacity means property wealth. So what the school district taxpayers are required to put toward that $8,100. And you see a similar pattern in the last biennium as what I project in this biennium. When reappraisal, the formula uses a 3-year average of property values. And so as that reappraisal starts to work its way through the formula, then our local capacity goes up and our state funding goes down. So in 24, this year, our local capacity was a little over $6,000, meaning we got close to $2,000 per student. With that reappraisal kicks in, our capacity is projected to go up to $6,500, which is a decrease of about $400 per student. So as you can imagine, being the 14th largest school district, over 10,000 students, a decrease of $400 is significant. And that's why you see our state funding go down. We'll talk about this later, but one of the risks is I assume that in the next biennium, 26-27, they will again continue to index those base costs for inflation. If they don't, and this reappraisal continues to work its way through, we would actually get less funding in the next biennium than we got this year. So that's a significant risk to us. But that is pretty much, in a nutshell, how state funding works in Ohio. On the expenditure side, salary and benefits decrease almost $1 million. So we're projecting 8 more FTE over the 5-year period due to an enrollment bubble that's working its way through our middle schools. So as it works its way through, we have added a couple staff a year toward that. But that's offset by savings from retirement. We have close to, I think, 17 or 18 retirements this year. We usually project 7 or 8. And so we save typically close to $50,000 per retirement when you replace those with entry-level teachers. So that savings from retirements more than offsets the additional staff that we have in the short term. On the service and supplies, the discretionary type budget, we have a $2.2 million increase. We've seen, I talked about interest earnings being higher. In reality, we'd prefer lower interest rates because of the negative impact it has on expenses for us. We're predominantly paying for services that are increasing fast, and we're seeing that in we're seeing that in our tuition that we pay for students placed in specialized programs and transportation, seeing some pretty significant increases. And then, as I mentioned, lastly, capital outlay. This is mainly the Amazon Bush Boulevard building, the Jeff Ebley Memorial Building. That was approved by the board earlier. I'm trying for you. So that's $6.3 million. Hopefully we will close soon if all things go well. But that was already in the budget. We're just now adding it to the forecast. So the bottom line, what does this mean? So we typically extend this out 10 years. So the dotted line you see is the 5-year forecast. But we really look in a 10-year position because it's important that we look at those 2 main lines there, surplus deficit, that's how much money we're spending over what we're taking in, not only at our cash balance, the bottom line, because if you wait too long to adjust your expenses or your revenue, then your second levy becomes insurmountable. So you're always taking a long-term view. We've always had a motto of reasonable levies at reasonable intervals. But what we see here is that we're in good financial shape in the 5 years, right? We start deficit spending in 2027, so our revenues are short $2.7 million. That's circled in red, but we have the cash balance to be able to handle that. Our cash balance doesn't go negative until fiscal 31. And so as we look at those 2 lines, those are the 2 lines we want to monitor. So what I told you today, it didn't change much from the prior forecast. I went back and I looked at what changed since we passed our operating levy in 2022. How are we doing? We're halfway through what we thought would be a levy cycle of 4 years. So we're halfway through that to 2024. And really what changed is on the revenue side. Higher reappraisal adds a couple $1 million a year in revenue. Our higher state funding adds a couple $1 million if it continues. and interest rates are higher. And so that really adds about $10 million a year in revenue. Our expenses, the second set of numbers here, are about the same, with the exception of the current year because of the building purchase, but we're pretty much in line with where we thought we'd be. But what that has effectively done is when we were on the ballot in 22, we projected deficit spending in 25. So we saw that 3.9 million deficit spending now moves ahead 2 years. We now project deficit spending in 27. Okay, so we see positive cash flow 2 years longer than we thought we'd have when we passed the levy. So the obvious question then is, can we delay the levy longer than 2026 as we anticipated? And again, we have to look at both the spending line and the cash balance line. And what I did for sake of argument here is I modeled in an incremental levy in 28 and 34, or in 32, sorry, that's a typo, in 28 and 32. And this shows that we would be short in the second levy slightly by $1.4 million, $19 million. Over 10 years, I'm comfortable saying that I think that's a manageable position to work toward. So I believe if the assumptions in the forecast hold true, that we could stretch this levy longer than 2026 and still leave ourselves in a decent position, in a manageable position in 2032, if that makes sense. However, there are risks to the forecast. We're making assumptions about the future. One of the biggest things is inflation. Inflation has stuck around longer than anyone had thought, and that puts pressure on various aspects of the assumptions here. Number one, it puts pressure on property values. We just went through reappraisal. Ohio has an update in 3 years, so 2026 will be a reappraisal update. Most believe that it won't be as high as we just saw. Updates usually aren't. But county auditors were faulted this past reappraisal for saying the last update was too low. And so it caused a higher escalation immediately than if they would have made the update higher. So we're assuming 10 to 12% in this forecast. It's likely, in my opinion, likely to be higher. But on the downside, that makes, with interest rates the way they are, that makes housing turnover tougher, right? Not as much inventory on the market. People can't afford to move if they have a good interest rate on their loan, and so that it may impact enrollment. And it also may impact state funding, as we just went through, depending on how our property values turn out. That has a direct impact now on a working formula. Also, the labor market continues to be tight. Our negotiated agreements are through 2026. I have 2.75% in the out years, but if the cost of labor doesn't come down, there could be pressure on that as well. And then lastly, the state budget. We talked about how it's calculated now, but one of the big things that's being talked about is a complete elimination of the state income tax. And if that gets pushed through, that's about a quarter of the entire state budget. So that's about $11 billion over a $40 billion budget. And so the indirect impact to us would be less funds available to fully fund the funding formula. And so that puts pressure on. We really need to see in the next biennium this funding formula pushed through to get it fully operational and continue to index the inputs, because if you're indexing in property values that are making us responsible to pay more of the state share, but you're not indexing the actual input, then that formula gets out of line real quick. Voucher expansion also plays into that with the total budget that the state has to work with. The more that's devoted to voucher expansion, the less likely or the more pressure it will have on traditional school funding. And then you also see budget commissions being discussed as a way to curtail local levies. So county budget commissions review what voters approve every year. And there's some discussion at the State House on giving them more authority to effectively reduce the amount that local governments can collect. So we'll see what comes out of that. What I would say is the biggest impact on Worthington's future financially is a shift in tax burden. So we've seen, as I mentioned, the state income tax, as you see on this chart, really for 20 years was a progressive structure that went all the way up to 7.5% on earners above $200,000. This year, that is less than half, right? So many people are paying no tax, but our highest earners are only paying 3.5%. That's good for everybody that's working, but the indirect impact of that is the chart on the right, where this shift in tax burden, so Class 1 real is code for residential property. So you see residential property, while these tax rates were in effect, paid about 46% of the total tax burden, while commercial property paid close to 54%. Fast forward to today, and that has gone from 2/3 of all property taxes are paid from residential homeowners, and only 1/3 is paid from commercial. So you see this dual shift of reduction in high income earners and also reduction in commercial property taxes moving onto the backs of residential property owners. And so as we saw that play out this March when 18% of school levies passed, it is going to be difficult to pass levies in the future. And then lastly, I was asked to look into whether we could remove our instructional fees, what financial impact that would have. So when we say instructional fees, these are the class fees, anywhere from $24 to $65 at the high school. Ohio Revised Code allows us to charge families a fee to offset what they consume in the classroom. So in kindergarten, think of markers, crayons, paper, all the way up to high school, think of lab materials, paper, things like that. Many districts around us have moved to eliminate those as part of free and public education. For us, that's anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 a year. And so on $200 million, it doesn't really move the needle. So if you look at this graph compared to the graph that I showed earlier, we still deficit spend the same year in 27. We still go negative the same year in 31. So I would say that that doesn't impact us materially either way. And with that, I will turn it over for any questions.